It's October 30th, 2012, and you're listening to a special edition of the Energy Education Podcast. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairewinds Energy Education. Fairewinds is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. The sole topic of tonight's conversation will be Hurricane Sandy and how it affected some of the operating U.S. nuclear power plants. So, without delay, we're joined by Arnie Gundersen, Fairewinds Chief Nuclear Engineer, to help us understand the situation. Arnie, thanks for coming on.
Hi, Kevin. Glad I could help.
I wanted to start right out with sort of a review. You were on yesterday, on Democracy Now! Yesterday and this morning, and you had basically gone over what you thought might happen with the hurricane and the nuclear power plants in its path. Can you just touch on that a bit?
Yeah, I was on Democracy Now! On Monday morning, and of course the hurricane hit Monday night. And we talked about the fact that when a nuclear plant, quote, safely shuts down, unquote, it really doesn't shut down because there's a lot of decay heat that's left behind. As much as 5% of the power of a nuclear reactor comes from decay heat. So when you hear the platitudes about a nuclear plant safely shutting down, that means the rods dropped in or shot up and cooled and stopped the chain reaction, but there's still a lot of heat that has to be dissipated. Then I talked about this, what I expected would happen, which would be something called the loss of offsite power. These plants are robust enough that they're not going to get blown over by an 85-mile-an-hour wind. So it never was a question of the effect of the wind on the power plant. It was actually a question of what the wind would do to the transmission lines. Sure enough, after the hurricane hit, many transmission lines throughout the country collapsed and left many power plants in the area without offsite power. Now, what's supposed to happen then was that the emergency diesels turn on and begin to provide power to the vital systems. Well, what I talked about on Democracy Now! Was that many of these plants, because it's October and that's a time when power plants refuel, had their fuel not in the nuclear reactor but in the spent fuel pool. And 40 years ago, when these plants were being built, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission decided that you didn't have to provide electricity to the pumps that cool the nuclear spent fuel pool. So you had all this high-level nuclear waste in the pool, but in the event you lost offsite power, the NRC said, well, that's okay. You don't have to provide power from the diesels. That was, I guess, the first eye-opener for the audiences around the country based on the emails we're getting. And the other thing I talked about was the storm surge. And I particularly talked about Oyster Creek for both of these, that a storm surge could likely hit the intake structures and destroy some vital cooling pumps inside.
That's what you said at the time. What actually happened now that we're a day into it?
Well, everything I said would happen did happen. At Oyster Creek, the storm surge got so high that there's conflicting reports. One report says it was 6 inches below these vital pumps called the service water pumps. Another report says it was 4 inches above these vital pumps. But in any event, the vital pumps that cool the nuclear plant were compromised by the storm surge. So that happened. But in addition, at Oyster Creek, the power from off-site was lost because of high winds. And then at Oyster Creek, they at least considered, according to Reuters, running fire hoses into the spent fuel pool to keep it cool. You see, once those pumps the electric pumps are shut down and there's no way to cool the pool, the only way to provide makeup water to the pool is through fire pumps. Now, to my way of thinking, fire pumps and nuclear power plants really don't belong in the same sentence. Nuclear Regulatory Commission lexicon, it's perfectly acceptable to make up for the evaporation from a spent fuel pool, by spraying fire water into it.
But of course, the Oyster Creek plant was shut down for refueling, so if it had lost cooling pumps, that would not have affected the reactor in this particular situation, right?
Well, the Oyster Creek plant was shut down for refueling, and that's actually what made it potentially more dangerous, because all the nuclear fuel was not in a place where the diesels provided electricity. So while there was less heat because the nuclear fuel was in this high-level waste pool, the fact of the matter is that pool was probably evaporating as much as 10,000 gallons a day, and likely even more, 15,000 gallons a day of water, so that the fire pumps were needed to make up for the water that was steaming off the fuel pool. Even Vermont Yankee, which is a very similar design, evaporates off about 3,000 gallons a day, and it's been shut down. The last time fuel was in its fuel pool was more than a year ago. So there's a lot of heat. If you leave a pot on your fire, it's gonna give off steam. Even if it doesn't boil, you'll eventually empty the pot. So at Oyster Creek, they needed to keep the fuel pool full, and apparently, according to Reuters, we're actually considering using fire hoses to spray water into the nuclear fuel pool.
So what's the status of the Oyster Creek fuel pool right now?
Oyster Creek is still on alert. Alert is the NRC has four categories of an emergency, and so hardly any plants ever go into an emergency status. But Oyster Creek is in an emergency status. The alert status is the second level. One is relatively minor. 4 is god awful, and the 2 and 3 are in between. What 2 means is that nuclear safety systems are in danger of being jeopardized, and that's a major concern. So here we are, more than a day after the tidal surge came in, and Oyster Creek is still on alert status.
So I understand the problem with the fuel pool and not being able to cool it because of the loss of offsite power. Basically, the diesels aren't set up in a nuclear plant to cool the fuel pool. But in this situation, you're saying that the storm surge, came up, there's 2 conflicting reports, either 4 inches above or 6 inches below the water pumps. To me, that seems like an incredibly close call. What if the reactor were running in that type of situation?
Oh, that would be worst case scenario. I mean, if Oyster Creek wasn't in a refuel and this tidal surge hit, it's exactly what happened to Fukushima Daiichi at that point. You've lost offsite power, and you can't cool the nuclear reactor because these pumps were flooded. So we can all be thankful that the plant was in a refueling outage and the power was down to less than 1% of what it would have been if it were operating. But there's a real lesson here, and the real lesson is that in light of global warming, we need to go back and reevaluate these nuclear plants to see if we've predicted what Mother Nature can really throw at us. Here's Oyster Creek, and it based its calculations. It was built in the 60s. So it looked back 100 years and said, well, this is the worst that Mother Nature can throw at us, and we'll build the pumps a little higher. But here we are now, almost 50 years since those decisions were made, and a superstorm comes in that, likely specified by global warming, and all the old rules are thrown out. This storm exceeded Oyster Creek's design basis event. And it's time for us not just to look at Oyster Creek, but every plant needs to take a look at its design basis floods to see if we can wipe out the pumps that are along the water, whether it's the ocean or whether it's along a river. That hasn't been done. And one of the obvious lessons from Fukushima should have been we've got to reevaluate the design basis flood. And in the United States, we haven't. Here we have Congress just questioned 4 NRC commissioners, and they all said, with the exception of the new chairman, they all said that they felt that the United States regulatory system and the United States nuclear industry, the proponents of nuclear power, promoters of nuclear power, were much better than the Japanese, and an accident couldn't happen here. Well, here we've got all of the precursor events to Fukushima. We've got a loss of offsite power, and then when the plant went over to its diesels, it needed to rely on the cooling system, and we have what's called the loss of the ultimate heat sink. So the 2 precursor incidents of Fukushima happened at Oyster Creek, and yet we have 4 NRC commissioners who are telling us it can't happen here. I think we really need to reevaluate our regulatory system and give our regulators some teeth to do what's right, as opposed to mimic what the nuclear promoters want to hear.
So it sounds like a little bit of luck got us through this one. Where do we go from here?
I don't know how long Oyster Creek will be shut down as a result of this. They were in a 21-day outage, and I'm sure they will be shut down longer than that because of the flooding in the intake structure. But if all they do is clean up the intake structure and start back up, they haven't learned a single lesson. One would hope that they reevaluate their design bases and say, oh my God, we built the intake structure too low. We've got to get it up higher. Or we need submersible pumps that run underwater. If that happens, Exelon has already said a year and a half ago that any more expenditures on Oyster Creek and they'll shut it down. I think that's really the key here. In the back of regulators' minds are that they risk losing some of these old single-unit nuclear plants because the people that own them aren't going to spend any more money on them. So they'll stick with outdated design bases that risk the public's health and safety, but keep these plants running. I think the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's role right now is to enable these old plants to continue to operate.
Arnie, last question. Can people rest assured that the worst is behind us as far as Hurricane Sandy and its effect on U.S. nuclear plants, at least for this round?
Yeah, I think we can say Oyster Creek is not going to become Fukushima, that there's enough attention, and now that they've rolled in fire pumps to keep the fuel pool cool, it will continue to be cooled, albeit abnormal, still be cool. We still may see some flooding on the inland plants, especially along the Susquehanna River. But I would suspect that management will be on the alert and have backup pumps in place. I think we've seen the worst, yes.
All right, Arnie, thanks so much for coming on tonight.
All right, that I could, Kevin. Thanks.
All right, this has been a special edition of the Energy Education Podcast. It's October 30th, 2012. The podcast is a project of Fairewinds Energy Education, a nonprofit whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation. You can catch us back here next Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern for the next edition of the Energy Education Podcast. I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.